Hi folks, and thanks for joining us today for our webinar, Understanding Intersex. My name is Charlie and I'm the MindOUT Project Officer here at the Alliance. Today I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands which we're all meeting on today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the LGBTI elders for whose strength and courage have paved the way for the work that we are doing here today. Today we have Bonnie Hart from AIS Support Group Australia doing a webinar for us on understanding intersex. We actually have a record number of people enrolled to do this, participate in this webinar today, so it's pretty exciting and just highlights the importance of continuing this conversation around intersex. Because of our record numbers, we may or may not be able to answer all your chat questions. So on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, you'll be able to see a type your message here box, and that's where you can ask questions as we go along today. If your question isn't answered, rest assured we will have access to all of them, and after we print off the chat report, we'll endeavour to get those questions answered for you and to the participants so you can all have access to those. I'd now like to hand over to lovely Bonnie for our webinar. Thanks, Bonnie.
Great, thanks, Charlie. Thanks to the Alliance for organising this webinar. It's great to have you all here. So I'm the current president of the AIS Support Group Australia. We're in our 31st year of providing peer support and advocacy service for intersex people in Australia. We predominantly started around the genetic variation of androgen associated with androgen insensitivity. But these days we realise that there are common elements that unite people with intersex variations, particularly in terms of the way of medical pathologization and social stigma. And these are the things that a lot of different parents have issues with, who have kids with intersex variations have issues with. And so we provide in-person and online support to both people with intersex variations and their family. So it's great to be here. I would also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we stand or sit at the moment, and their elders past and present. I also want to take time to honour my intersex elders. As an intersex person, it's really difficult because there are so few visible people out there that are doing like actually even seeing, we have really almost no role models. There's no like trad Shakespeare sonnets about intersex people. There are no, we don't necessarily exist within that kind of realm to a degree. So to actually have people that have been courageous of breaking that like stigma and silence and coming forth and like defending, often very importantly, defending rights and human rights of intersex people, and being present to be an aggregation point for other people out there who feel alone has been incredibly important. And it's usually been very thankless, and people haven't known about intersex very much. So I'd also like to thank you for coming, and I'm very appreciative that you're all taking the time out to know a bit more. So what is intersex? This particular definition here, the term is the one that's currently used by the Australian Attorney General, and it refers to people who are born with genetic, hormonal or physical sex characteristics that are not typically male or female, and that intersex people have a diversity of bodies and gender identities. So I'm going to spend a bit of time looking at some statistical information about what we know about intersex population. It's we're really hidden and really quite marginalized. It's really hard to actually find an intersex person, even though looking at the statistic that is offered of 1.7% of occurrence within the population by Anne Foster Sterling in 2000. that's of an overall representation of all of the genetic variations. So we're talking like a large number, 30 plus or something like that, of different terminologies or syndromes or these ways of talking about it. You'll notice that as I go further through these slides, that terminology is very tricky, and I'm really like aware that I only represent and can only speak on behalf of the intersex people with intersex characteristics that I've met and I've talked to, and I acknowledge that there's bias in that because I run a support group. So I like to think that I can speak with some confidence, but I know that you can never represent truly a whole demographic of people, particularly one as wildly diverse as intersex people. So just as an example, my genetic variation, which is like complete androgen insensitivity, has an occurrence about 1 in 40,000 live births. So that is, you know, like that seems like not very much, but I was certainly told that it was a really rare condition. But within the city that I live in, there's still 50 people that have my genetic variation. So, and I know 5 of them, and I hope that starts asking the questions that why it's so hard to identify people. Why don't people why aren't people more connected? What are the barriers that stop people from learning more and being more self-accepting about their bodies? I'll go into this a little bit more as we go further through. So I'm not going to go through each and every one of these different variations because there's so many of them, but these are different kind of syndromes that have been like medically labeled, I suppose. And you'll see as we go forward that the ways of talking about intersex characteristics has predominantly existed, and that some sort of problems for as a person when we start talking about this stuff. So yeah, like I again, maybe not everyone with these variations would actually even consider themselves to have an intersex variation, even though they do exist within that framework. Intersex, I suppose, was the more traditional way of talking about these particular variations in genetic presentation, like physical presentation and hormonal levels. And we saw a change in terminology happen about 10 years ago, where disorders of sex development was introduced and widely proliferated throughout the medical environment. And it's been incredibly contentious, not only within intersex community, but also within clinical terms. Okay, so I've just been told that my audio is dropping in and out. I'm sorry. Hopefully it is better for some people out there. So what I wanted to just talk about is with these slides, you can see that intersex variations and genetic variations can happen to individuals with XY chromosomes. They can also happen to people with XX chromosomes, and it can occur within people with either XX or XY chromosomes, or neither XX or XY chromosomes, or may just spontaneously occur. So, in terms of the biological science behind it, there's still a lot that is not known, and many different intersex variations, the actual causes of them within that medical framework hasn't been yet determined, and there's still quite a lot of research in that environment that happens. So I'm going to talk more about you'll be able to find quite a lot of reference on the internet about intersex from a medicalized point of view. There hasn't been really much data that's been established about how people with intersex characteristics will exist within a social context or in a social environment. And earlier this year, I was fortunate enough to co-publish a sociological research paper called Intersex Stories and Statistics from Australia, 2016, with Tiffany Jones from the University of New England, along with several other people. The link for that is also available through the Alliance page, or the ad page for this webinar. As you can see, we had 272 participants in our sample, which is a good enough beefy size in order for statistical purposes to get an understanding. I think it's really good to mention as well that from a medicalized point of view, a lot of the follow-up studies that happen for surgeries are usually based on really small cohorts of people that have existed within a medicalized framework. And in that way, I would posit that there's not real true controls that have been used in that sort of environment, like controls where people with intersex variations haven't been highly medicalized from a young age, or haven't received various normalizing treatments that a lot of intersex people often experience. So when we start talking about terminology, we can see that that from within our cohort we can see that intersex is by far the largest percentage of people use this particular terminology in order to talk about their bodies. But you can also see that the language that people use varies across situation in which that person is talking about themselves. So the blue is for words you prefer to use about yourself, and predominantly that is intersex, and the red is words used when accessing medical services. And you can see that although disorder of sex development, or DSD, is incredibly low for people talking about themselves, you see a spike when people are trying to access appropriate medical services. And this is I will profess that I've used that as well, and that's generally because many, it's to overcome ignorance. Some people have terminology around one area, and some people have terminology around another, and this does create this complexity. Does have repercussions for individuals. So if individuals are only talked about their chromosomes or their variation, or like their condition, then what we'll end up finding is that they don't have access to just say like this intersex support services, which use a more general terminology, or they may use the term DSD but think that there's like intersex may be stigmatizing, or vice versa, and so not use those different terminologies. And I like to honor people's perspective, because I think that like intersex people have had a lot of decisions made on their behalf a lot of the time. So like the way that people feel empowered in order to talk about their body is the best way. But having access to proper information and having access to terminologies and ways of speaking about your body that are empowering, and that you don't perpetuate stigma when you're even trying to educate people about your body in order to access basic services or sustain relationships, I think is really important to consider. And for me, I consider it a part of self-acceptance. So when I've become more self-accepting, I've learned how to talk about my body in more beneficial and less pathologizing ways. Like I will still use terminology to talk about my anatomy that was given to me by doctors when I was a child, and it's just existed within my subconscious. And I spent so many years not talking about intersex at all, denying it, and there was never any entry point. Like, I don't actually, my intersex variation isn't very visible from the outside. If I didn't disclose to people, then they may not notice without an untrained eye. So it was very easy for me to just not engage with any of that disclosure or talk about it. But what that ended up doing more and more was very small, like not menstruating and all of these types of things. And so eventually it just became more and more pressure on me in order to maintain the illusion that, that binary sex was a real thing as opposed to like a socialized construction. Anyway, it's quite difficult. It's quite amazing for me to even be here talking about intersex, because when I was a teenager, or even 10 years ago, there was no way that I could have perceived myself to even be able to talk about it. And what ended up happening is I didn't even have the words to be able to talk about it. So I wasn't actually, I didn't even have language, and it was really stilted. And then I couldn't communicate how awesome it was, because no one had ever told me how awesome it was, and I didn't know how to frame that even in language. Or the only language I had to talk about it with was pathologized language or something like this. And so instantly, when I started to try and form relationships or have intimate relations with other people, then I could, like these days I've got better language. I've been practicing. I've made myself do it. Because I just realized that if I don't learn to talk about it, I don't know how to conceptualize it. I don't know the full realm of what it means to even be me. And I can't look after my own health, or I can't even make the right decisions that are based on a positive way forward, as opposed to a concealing or negative kind of way. That's my perspective, and that's probably why I'm here today. So, as you can see, language is a very important aspect to it, and there are many different ways. So we may even have people who have those genetic variations that existed on the last couple of slides that will not even use a term like intersex or even DSD in order to talk about their bodies, because they have a specific syndrome or something like that. But generally, that kind of specific isolation of those symptoms prevents people from having an understanding about the long-term effects of various treatments that may be offered in order to remedy those systems. And I found from being engaged in intersex advocacy and running a support group that there's so much wisdom from intersex people, because they have to advocate to receive basic services and educate that they have had to become experts in their own condition. So, and considering, I'll get a bit further into that later. So from this side, we can see that there are a variety of different, so this is sex reported at birth and also sex now. So you can see that there is some movement between those two. That's a different 52% of people. So people have shifted around. So you can see that there is a trans experience that may be associated for some people, intersex people, but the majority of people do identify as being either male or female. Yes. When we start talking about sexual orientation, you can see from this slide that although, maybe people within our cohort of 176 people in this group, then you can see that compared to the Australian average population, people with intersex variations may have a higher proportion or chance of identifying as either same-sex attracted or queer or asexual. But again, the majority of people identify as heterosexual. So I think within an LGBTI context, I think it's really important to remember that that we are also talking about hetero people within that context. It's not just LGBTI isn't a synonym for sexuality or gender identity. We're also talking about cis-identified hetero people within that context, and that's it's a really useful and important systemic thing, particularly in terms of larger organizations that are trying to become intersex inclusive. Another thing I should mention about the data here is that people were able to choose multiple fields. I think it was really important in the actual survey. It wasn't an either-or scenario in any of the data that was obtained, and we'll know that that's just an extension of, I suppose, the binary nature of things having to be in one box or another. But so some people may have be heterosexual, but maybe fluid heterosexual to some degree, so they're able to select more than one aspect. That's why some of these slides don't add up to 100%, just so you know. And a recording of this will be available for people later on for future reference as well. And there's also a link to the book, which is the report, which is available through Creative Commons. So it's it doesn't cost anything, so you can actually read the in-depth qualitative information. So this slide talks about whether or not how having a body that is different from conventional standards, or the treatment that has been given to that body, affects someone's sexual desire. So I'm starting to talk about relationships and intimacy, because as adults, I think that is probably one of the major concerns that I've seen from people is a lot of treatments can actually affect sensitivity of genital areas, or people may have genitals or bodies that don't conform to standardized views of what males and females should look like, and that can obviously cause people distress, not so much because they are different, but just in the way of, again, having to educate and inform everyone about themselves, even just in order to become intimate with someone. So we can see that it really does affect the way that people feel about connecting with others. And we can also see that the flow down effect of this is that 65% of people, of intersex people within the survey, 175, have never been married, and also maybe in same-sex relationships that aren't legitimate in Australia. So this, obviously, marriage equality also affects intersex people, and there is a case study of someone with my genetic variation in Queensland, where the fact that they have had XY chromosomes was used as a justification to annul a marriage, even though the person was cis-identified female and, for all intents and purposes, occupied a female space in society. So that has happened in Australia, and you'd want to think that, I don't think the marriage was kind of on the rocks anyway if they were pulling that kind of card with one another. You'd want to think, but these are very real issues as well, and you can see that people will even won't disclose their intersex variation some of the time to their intimate partners because of fear of rejection, and some sort of inherent homophobia that goes along with that. And to be honest, that type of homophobic basis for decision making can be seen within the medicalized framework of how intersex variations are surgically normalized and treated from birth. Like, I do know that, like, the ideal environment is to actually have penetrative, like, heterosexual sex is the end goal for most surgeries or treatments such as dilation. Yeah, sorry, I was just asking a question. So this slide, when we start looking at here, is about what types of interventions people have actually experienced. And you can see the majority of these are hormonal treatments. But you can also see, like, this is a division of what age the various treatments happened. And the majority of treatments that happen at a young age during infancy, which is the blue, are the more extreme treatments, such as removal of the gonads, which is like results in sterilization, or genital reconstruction, which may involve quite invasive surgeries that would create scarification. And although you know, technology has improved and these procedures have improved, all surgeries result in scarification and some loss of sensitivity. And really, when we're talking about up to 5 years old, we're also talking about these people not being able to fully informally consent to those treatments. So that is a decision-making process that has been steered by clinicians and parents. So, you know, that in itself is very difficult. But you also do, and also at adolescence is a really large section for that. The reason that is because many intersex variations only become apparent at puberty. Like, I know with my genetic variation, because it's not so externally obvious, it usually only becomes apparent when people, like when women don't menstruate at puberty, then that gets investigated, and perhaps they will find out that they have an intersex variation. Yeah, so, you know, like, if you do have your gonads removed, which I did when I was 12, and I consented, apparently. I got my medical records, and I saw my signature on the consent line, but I can't actually say that I consented to the life that I've had as a result. I don't think that there was much of a conception about the importance of having to maintain hormone levels and do bone density checks, which have resulted in me having osteopenia. The hormones that I was put on were like that, which would normally be prescribed to a postmenopausal woman. They were incredibly low, and they were womany, whereas naturally I would have produced high levels of testosterone that then would have been converted into estrogen through a process called aromatization. So I did spend a good many years of my life feeling a sense of complete body dysphoria, like I wasn't even in my own body. I already felt socially alienated because I knew I was different, and I had no one to talk to about that. But then on top of that, I also felt alienated from my own body that was alien. And it wasn't until maybe I was 30 that I finally found an endocrinologist that would prescribe me testosterone again, because there was a culture of not doing that, because we're apparently insensitive. But the sense, you know, like, I don't know how insensitive is supposed to be, but like the sense of well-being that I got from taking that, and now I'm testosterone all the way. I don't virilize, and I feel myself for the first time as a child. So hormones are so important. They affect every part of your cognition or perception of reality. Like, they are all pervasive. And if you don't get the right match, if you don't get a bioidentical match, then you will experience some form of body dysphoria. You will experience a change. And the idea of having massive amounts of change as a result of these surgeries is traumatic, and trauma is the thing that creates negative experience. So all these things do come into place. I'm just going to move on because I know that we don't have much time. I think that from that last slide, you can see that many surgical interventions happen in childhood, but also a lot happen in teenage years. And this slide is really important for looking at that. So in the blue are people with intersex, the purple are intersex variations, and the one in yellow is the Australian general population. So you can see that this is the highest level of educational attainment. 18% of people didn't graduate from secondary school, so from high school, as opposed to an Australian population of 2%. So this is pretty shocking in terms of what has happened within this environment, what has happened in a youth context when people are talking and forming identity and finding their place within a social society and the world beyond the family to begin with. And if their intersex variation is visible from the outside, then we can assume that there's some level of bullying. And I've heard anecdotal stories that this is the case. So, but encouragingly, you'll see that on the other hand, there's intersex people, if they do survive the torture of high school, then they may be equipped with the resilience required in order to continue on and achieve postgraduate studies. So there is something going on there from we are different, and the experience of being different, and maybe even the effects of being surgically altered because of those differences within a critical framework may produce untoward effects. What else do I want to say about that? Sorry, this format's very new for me. If you're working on the webinar, I'm kind of talking to myself. Sorry, just to clarify, so it's 18% of people, where primary school is the highest level of completed studies. So normally 2% of the Australian population don't have primary school as their highest level, whereas 18% of people with intersex variations haven't seen that. So I was just answering a question then that came up on the screen. You can see also that the flow-on effects of this poorer life outcomes in terms of income. So we know that the average wage is around $60,000 a year in Australia. And the poverty line is something like $26,000 a year. You can see that the majority of people within this survey group existed below the poverty line, which is stark and shocking and sad. But at the same time, people still exist in the highest pay bracket as well. So that also goes to show that there's nothing inherently bad about having an intersex variation. Often, the fact that people can achieve well and do have cognitive capacity in order for postgraduate studies and to be successful in an economic frame of life means that with the right attitude and the right conditioning and the right sort of support, then people can achieve well or overcome the insurmountable amount of stigma that's associated with being different in society. And it's by no means an easy thing to do, especially if you don't even have the language in order to start unpicking that mess or educating people. So unfortunately, a large amount of people aren't able to do that. So, in myself, I exist within under the $20,000 a year bracket, but I'll soon have a postgraduate study. So there is also that dichotomy as well of not being able to engage within a workplace. And the reason that has happened for me, I suppose, just to be anecdotal about it, is because it is about identity and about lying. Do you know, like I don a work vibe and I don a work jacket, but then that's kind of at some point it's just like a pretending to be something that I'm not. And after a while that breaks down or has broken down, and I can't maintain that over a long period of time. And it's really stressful, you know, and I end up like having had these large cycles of depression or something like that where I would have to just lie down for a long time. So made it very difficult in order to maintain long-term employment. So yes, just for a little bit of a story there. This slide kind of talks about how visible different people's genetic variations are. So you can see that the largest bar in this is where people's intersex variations are completely invisible to like onlookers. Like people wouldn't know about it. That may just be some like hormonal chromosomal difference, or some internal physiological differences. So obviously the more visible people's difference is, the higher levels of stigma that they would receive. And that also does put people at risk for violence, transphobic, homophobic violence as well, which is something that we do hear about, which results in, I suppose, the terrible mental health statistics that we found out from this survey about, even though people at the moment, the majority of people rated their present mental health as good or better, we still heard stories about a history of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, among other clinical diagnoses for mental health issues that have existed within their lifetime. 12% of people were unemployed, which is, almost 3 times the Australian population. I think it's about 4 or 5% at the moment, which in itself has its own set of psychological issues and stigma associated with it. So we're starting to see now, like you'll see that there's a compounding that happens with intersex people. And not only are they not able to talk about their bodies, and society is generally unaccepting about that, to the point where, their bodies have been surgically altered to conform. And these surgical alterations quite often are just for cosmetic purposes. There's only a few and very minority of intersex variations that actually pose an immediate medical risk. So yeah, and then also, there is the thing of the compounding of parents typing in intersex into the computer and coming up with an LGBTI context. So that is another layer of stigma. Maybe those parents would have deep faith, and that's not appropriate for them. So we're starting, you can see that there's lots of kind of intersectional issues that affect intersex people. And people with intersex variations occur across all socioeconomic environments. They occur across racial boundaries. They occur all over the earth. So it's not something that's just specific for this country. Fortunately, in this country, we're privileged enough to have people who have access to services and the ability to talk about it, and organizations like the Alliance that can facilitate this type of learning. We know that that's not the case for a lot of developing countries, and consequently, part of my work is responding to email inquiries from people in places who don't have access to services, and because they look online and they try and find out content about their bodies and face the online research can be really daunting when researching your intersex variation, because not only is there such a diverse number and like quality of information that's available, but a lot of it's incredibly pathologizing and really post-surgery. So, and there, and then there's also such a variety of different clinical approaches. There's no consensus about what treatments for each intersex variation are appropriate. And again, no long-term follow-up data. So like generally what we'll find, like I get this is anecdotal. So like some people contact me who really are desperate for surgery in different countries because they've researched, and that is the context of the way of treating, of getting the best possible care that they've determined from looking online. But they have no connection with other people, and generally, yeah, it can get very complicated. There's lots of different ways of looking at intersex bodies. Which brings me to the way that people look about themselves. So like obviously like intersex people, like 42% of them have thought about self-harm and 26% have engaged, and suicidal ideation 60% and attempt of suicide of 19% are really horrible statistics. Like they're far greater than average population, and these are just the people that actually answered the survey as well. So we can only assume that actually, well, like within the population, the statistics may be higher. And I think that also is youth is a really critical zone for that as well, because it is a lot about self-acceptance. It is a lot about learning about yourself within an environment and knowing that there are options and different ways of even thinking about your body or meeting other people that have got it. So if you're isolated, then you don't know other people with the same variation as you, or if you don't even know a positive way of even framing your own body within your own context, then that's going to create a lot of internal conflict. And from my experience, and that's the case. So, yeah. So I'm just looking at a question that's come in. Are the self-harm stats about people who have in the past had thoughts or are currently experiencing? So it was at some point in their life. Have you ever experienced this sort of scenario? Yeah, that's right. And so all of these statistics are from that Intersex Stories and Statistics in Australia by the Jones et al. 2016. So, just to quickly run through, like I've talked a little bit about these things from my context. Like these are kind of the health issues that are associated with having a body that doesn't conform to sex standards. And language is a really big one, like knowing how to talk, not talking in a pathologizing way is really helpful, especially from a service provision point of view. And even finding out how the person likes to talk about their body is a really good way of starting, because the last thing you want to do is disempower anyone even further from when talking about their bodies, to kind of honor the knowledge that's in the individual. So yeah, medical pathologization and surgery kind of go together. Really, I advocate for autonomy and an informed decision-making process and delay of surgery, simply because the whole surgical environment for me was really traumatic. Not just the surgery in itself and the subsequent lying that had to happen, and vaginal dilation and all of these different types of treatments that were very invasive and not very pleasant, but the actual repeated having to go to the doctor and lots of student nurses looking at my genitals and inserting things into me, like, was really not cool. It doesn't recede in my memory really well, and I don't think it was actually incredibly necessary for my health. And my body was otherwise healthy. So most of my health issues these days are the result of the treatments that I received at that particular time, which is why maintenance is such an important thing. Proper heart HRT and bone density are really important for people with my variation that have had a gonadectomy. Getting the right hormones, as I said, so that people do feel like that they don't experience such a radical change in their body if they do decide to undergo those surgeries. And some people will, some people find, like their undescended testes may be really painful, or there may be like there's cancer risk associated with like really anything these days, but cancer risk was used as justification for a lot of surgeries. My parents were told that the chance of my gonads becoming cancerous was about 50%. And in the recent Senate inquiry report, where they looked at a lot of those statistics, they did a comparative analysis and found that the chance was about 0.8%. So that's radically different. 0.8%, like we don't preemptively remove XY male testes for the risk of testicular cancer, or even breasts in people with a genetic tendency towards breast cancer. So why should we remove this natural source of hormones from people preemptively? Like that's my point of view. Because you do have to then like look after your body in a way that other people may not have to. And it's just further like medicalization and pathologization of what would otherwise a healthy body. Obviously, in people, if you have a body that doesn't conform to like female standards, then you may have different requirements in terms of maintaining good sexual health. Even though many people with intersex variations are naturally unable to have children biologically, they can still contract sexually transmitted diseases. So sexual health is important, and having appropriate protection is also like an area for development, I think. And obviously access to services is one of the major issues that I find. Like in my role, I have to refer people to even just find a GP that is aware of intersex so that they can coordinate specialist services for that person. And particularly within a rural context, it's so incredibly difficult in order to even do that. The amount of people that instantly conflate trans and intersex, even within a clinical point of view, like or who are GPs or the like. So it can be really difficult, like to actually find, like, and if I do find someone that is open to having a reflexive conversation about how people see their bodies and what types of treatments and what is appropriate and are well informed, then I do refer to them vigorously. It's really wonderful to actually have that. But it's not, it's very difficult thing to actually do. So talking about psychological issues and psychosocial issues, I personally see stigma as being one of the core reasons why a lot of the surgeries exist. So like, I suppose there's a cycle of stigma that happens, where lack of knowledge or lack of education about bodily difference creates fear and anxieties within parents, which are then offered clinical treatments, because many intersex variations are diagnosed and are first identified within hospital, particularly ones that are very visually different. So offering of a clinical treatment in a clinical context kind of goes hand in hand. But effectively what that ends up doing is removing the removing the visibility of intersex within society as well. So in that creates this circular thing of the lack of education from being like surgically erased to some degree, then that perpetuates the idea of like that surgeries do, like the myth of binary, I suppose. And even breaking that is incredibly difficult because it involves so much education. Consequently, what we find is that a lot of these issues are family issues. Parents are forced with making extremely large decisions that have lifelong implications a lot of the time for their children within a pediatric environment. And I certainly know that, there is the chance that those decisions won't be the right ones, and that the family unit will then have to deal with that for the, like they'll have to work with those issues. And I've seen families torn apart because of various levels of acceptance and blame and guilt that happens. And also the culture of secrecy that goes along with having to surgically erase intersex. So generally in my organization, I start seeing people in their 20s when they've left that culture of secrecy or that way of even thinking about their own bodies and have gotten out into the world and realized that, yes, they need to actually learn more about themselves so that they can become self-accepting, so that they can look after their bodies in the best possible way. And obviously, like that kind of isolation that is involved in being so secretive and taking on all of the responsibility of social stigma, and makes it really hard in order to even talk about it and even to share that. So like disclosure is like often can be parents' responsibility of disclosing their intersex variation to their children. There has been an institutional history of complete concealment of people's genetic variations, and many people haven't found out until they're adult or get their medical records and actually find out they may have, like chromosomes that they weren't expecting to be there, like they actually see the surgical procedures that happen. And like that obviously is incredibly shocking and damaging and can really damage relationships within family. So, the theory is kind of similar to that of adoption in terms of age appropriate disclosure, and framing things that the child can understand so that there's a natural progression in order to talk about their bodies. And, it should be up to the individual in order to tell people when they want to tell people and have the language in order to do that. Like, you don't want to turn around and out someone, like, even someone like you can see in this slide, this is my sister Phoebe. We made a documentary called Orchids, My Intersex Adventure, which was a really big way of coming out, no better way than coming out on national TV and outing yourself and your whole family that there's like an intersex variation in your family. No. So like that was it was actually the starting ground for me doing the work that I am now. Like I would never have really talked about this stuff before, but then actually realizing that by doing, like this, I have to learn to speak about it. But I still found people will want to talk about it within a context that was not appropriate. Like someone outed me in front of all of my friends when I hadn't even had that pleasure of doing it, because we were starting to talk about documentary and they had, before it was being even made. So it is very sensitive, particularly within a youth context. So as more education happens, then people may spontaneously disclose within that environment, and people need to be connected and supported in that vibe. Because at the moment, we don't really have, like young people it's a difficult time between pediatric and adult services, even within hospital environments, and there's not very great connection between those two. So a lot of people are lost. And again, that is also a time when many surgeries happen as well, which can be traumatic for an individual, particularly if they're not connected or supported, which doesn't kind of flow into how intimate you can be with someone and relationships. between individuals. Like it's not an area that's well studied. There's not very many good models of how to be in a successful relationship with a person whose body doesn't conform. But obviously unconditional love is just the best way forward for anyone really. And when we're talking about people with intersex variations, we are fundamentally talking about people. Yes. And yeah, obviously intersex people can have families. There's a variety of different ways of having families. Some people can have biological children, and other people can adopt, or like there's a number of different ways, and we exist within families and contribute to that family unit, and would have done since the beginning of time, because intersex variations are not new. We've existed within history. So obviously there are specific issues when looking at employment and education of intersex people, how to make your service so that people can bring their whole selves to work. And the Pride and Diversity resource that's also listed on the fact page for this webinar is a good starting point for that. Obviously, as we would have seen in the recent Olympics, people's intersex variations come up quite a bit in sport, which is still one of those environments which is really gender divided. And unfortunately, we can see people vilified ostensibly for having bodies or chromosomes that don't match, like binary expectations. And those people can be penalized even though they perform, they're competing within the gender that they were born and identify their whole lives with. And mostly this occurs to women. So there is that level of social expectation, I suppose, about what makes a woman's body that goes along with that as well. Obviously there's diversity of the ways that intersex bodies are represented in media and throughout history, and some of those can be incredibly sensationalized and some of them can be more realistic. But what we are seeing now is that there's more consultation that's happening with peers, and which we think is really great. I think it's really awesome if you want to learn about intersex and to actually learn from intersex people. That's the nothing about us without us scenario. And obviously within an aged care environment also creates different considerations for people with intersex variations. Particularly, you may find people that are older have received treatments in an era that was all about secrecy and stigma and surgical alteration, and may have lived their whole life accordingly, and consequently may, like in an aged care environment, a lot of privacy may be reduced, and if their bodies are different or they're not comfortable in that sort of environment, that may create extra levels of stress. Obviously, visibility and being connected has helped me immensely in my life. That's the reason why I'm now the president of the support group, because it was I grew up thinking that I was the only intersex person around. I didn't even know that my elder sister had the same genetic variation, because we weren't encouraged to talk about it as a secret. Society of secrecy around it with my own family, and it's just, so it was quite great to actually do that, and then also speaking with other people and just being able to talk about stuff without having to educate people was absolutely transformative. It was singly the most cathartic thing that has happened, and started me on a path of complete self-acceptance, and also I just am able to run stuff by people where I just never have before, so it's encouraged me to be less of a loner in that way. And we're seeing people and these networks of people across the globe linking together now and speaking in a similar kind of way about similar issues, which makes me feel like we're not just, like when you're a isolated and marginalized minority member, you can sometimes be like, what does everyone else think? So it's actually really great to have that kind of confirmation and support. And consequently, because of that visibility and because we have peer-run organizations in this country, we are able to represent and make inclusion meaningful into the future for people with different genetic variations. And I'll just do a tip of the hat to the follow-up webinar that will happen in 2 weeks' time, which is being presented by Morgan Carpenter from OII, who will delve more closely into the human rights aspects that are currently, that are associated with intersex variations, but also the human rights movement and a lot of the changes that have been happening in recent times in terms of, respecting individuals' bodily autonomy, ensuring that people are able to make informed consent for the treatments that they receive, and ensuring that people with intersex variations are protected. So thank you so much. You can find out more about our organisation from the AISSGA.org.au website. My name is Bonnie. Thanks for attending.
Thanks so much, Bonnie. That was an amazing presentation, and that just shows people are really appreciating your lived experience as well. So thank you for sharing that as well. As I've messaged folks attending this, we did have a record number today of participants. So thank you to those that have taken the time to join us on the webinar. And because of this, we will do some follow-up emails answering the questions that were posted in the chat area, along with the link to this webinar once it's made available online, and also any resources that Bonnie has mentioned throughout the presentation. So we'll spend some time putting that together for you and email all attendees. As Bonnie said, we are having another one on the 7th of December from Morgan Carpenter, so I can include those details in the follow-up email. But thanks again, Bonnie. As you can see by the chat, everyone's really appreciative of you taking the time to talk to them today. So thank you, Bonnie. And thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, my pleasure. Bye.